and the screen is going to show different things that will illustrate my thinking. Right? So the first thing that I want to say about astrology is that it's a language. And just like when you learn a language, you have to learn the letters and then the words before you can make sentences and paragraphs and create complicated concepts. It's super important to become familiar with most basic form, because otherwise, when you try to look at charts, you won't see much, or you'll get a lot of confusing information and you won't be able to make good progress. So one of the things that happens in popular astrology is that the signs get thrown around, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and then you hear things about houses, you hear all kinds of things. But the thing about astrology is that the most important factor, the most raw astrology, is the planets themselves. And you can actually do really good astrology without any signs. And in fact, there's a school, German school, I think it was called cosmobiology. Reinhold Eberton in the 20th century did not use signs at all. And yet they were producing great astrology because the planets are the key element. And so that's the place to begin, place to consider. And in fact, planets are tremendous sources of life information and self-knowledge as well. Just the pure sense of a planet, even if you didn't do any charts and studied it only for that. And so then the question becomes, well, what do they mean? Where do you start? And again, I'm sure you've seen some of the meanings and you have some ideas. I'm going to present my own here so you have a sense of how I approach this, how I think about it. And then I'll go on to the next topic. So I use the planets in the solar system: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars. I use 11 because, first of all, I don't throw out Pluto. Pluto was thrown out by astronomers. That's not a good idea for astrologers. Pluto continues to work even if you attempt to throw it out. And I use Eris because Eris was discovered in 2005 and was the main reason why Pluto was thrown out. It was the planet that upset the apple cart. And in astrology, the synchronicity of events is really important. And you see this all the time by, for example, you see that Pluto was discovered when nuclear power was discovered by the human race, and Pluto rules nuclear power. And you see that when Uranus was discovered in 1790 was the advent of electricity, and Uranus rules electricity. So then when you see a planet being discovered, you know it's important. Eris is still being studied by astrologers. I have some ideas, pretty strong ideas about it, but it's a work in progress because it takes time to see what it's doing and so on. But I use, as I say, the original 10, not throwing out Pluto, and then Eris as well. And then your next question might be, all right, well, what's most important? And this is where, ironically, having said that in astrology, it turns into a sun sign fest of sorts where people spend all their time, I'm Aries, I'm Taurus, and they even build systems to do, what I call low-level prediction, where you put the sun on the ascendant and start saying things about every sign like it's going to happen that way, which, if you think about it, cannot possibly be true, because then you're making 12 categories, and then the same thing would happen to all the signs, and it doesn't, right? But that said, the sun is really important, and the reason is that you're doing this. You're drawing charts, but it's the solar system. It's an actual living thing that we're in. It's our life. I mean, it's not something separate. It's where the Earth is. And in fact, astrology, probably most of you already know, is a map of you as the center with all the planets around you, which is the reason, in a way, why science rejected it back in the Middle Ages, because the world became very scientific. And, once Galileo said, no, the sun is actually the center. At the time, that was really revolutionary, and he had to withdraw his thinking. I mean, it was pretty crazy stuff, but scientists gain ascendancy. The sun is the center. And so if you are strictly scientific, in quotes, you'd say, how can you make a chart and put yourself at the center? Because that's the point of astrology. Astrology is you at the center, right? But even so, even though the sun is the actual center and I'm putting it around me, it's pretty big. I don't know if you saw what I said on Linda's channel around the mass of the solar system. I like to use the money analogy and talk about the value of the solar system as $100, which then puts the sun's value at 99.86, which means the sun is almost all of the solar system. All of these planets here are worth 14 cents, which isn't much. And then Jupiter, which is the big dog, is 10 cents. Saturn is 3 cents. So now you have all these planets, it's 1 penny, very small. So even if you don't want to get into the discussion about the value of Jupiter and Saturn being bigger, which it is, just focus on the sun and realize that's a really big force. So discovering what that is in your chart, both by, astrologically, by sign for sure, but especially by position, a whole bunch of things, and in the raw format, meaning the discovery of it in your own body. What is it that the sun connects you to? And the sun, if you do, any kind of go online, Google astrological sun meanings, you'll see that it mentions vitality, purpose. Those two alone, huge, right? You should be thinking, if I have vitality and I have purpose, I'm probably going to be doing fairly well because I'll be connected to my purpose and I'll have vitality. Vitality is literally your life force. It's what helps you to feel good versus when you don't feel good. It's that simple. So this is really important to remember, even though you go on to look at all the other planets because they're also very important. The solar force is huge. And so then when you're doing astrology to try to figure out, well, how does this chart work? What's going to happen next? You are in effect first and foremost looking at what are the cycles to the sun, because the sun is your biggest force, right? So the other ones will have effect too, of course, and I'm not diminishing that. But the sun cycles, the cycles to the sun are most important, right? So then going from there, the moon is very important for a different reason. The moon is right next to the earth. There's pretty good evidence that were it not for the moon, we wouldn't even exist because, the way things worked out, they're doing a kind of, dual dance, and it's what moves the tides. And I mean, if you took it away, there would be some pretty serious problems. That's what, by the way, Louis Gohmert wanted to do, according to his logic of climate change. We just need to fix the orbit of the moon. We're not going to go there for now. Let's go back to the moon, the astrological moon. So the moon is super important because when you look in the body, the moon is the stomach, breast, stomach is in this area, but most critically, it's the original food. It's breast milk. You're born, that's the first thing that you're fed. Then what happens is, as you move away from that food, it connects to all the other food the rest of your life. And food is obviously really important. It's what you're taking in. Now, of course, it is true that you're not just taking in food as food to survive and feed your body. You're also taking in impressions and you're taking in all kinds of things. So it is the intake mechanism of everything. This is why, for example, when people recommend, don't watch too many horror movies because, then you'll be dreaming of people carrying axes, whatever. So that's because you're using those impressions too much, and maybe you shouldn't. But the first and most key, and you can't really call it an impression, is the substance of actual food, right? And the lunar force, in contrast to the sun, you would always say is a fiery force. It's fire. It rules Leo, in the connections to the signs. It's a fire source. The moon is watery. And if you think about it, food is water because you masticate it and then you turn it into water, hopefully. And then, and then of course there's the fact that the body is 2/3 water. So it makes perfect sense, right? The moon is very important, and there are entire systems where they will put top priority on the moon. That's not my way of doing it. I think it's strange to do that. I think the sun is too overwhelmingly big to ignore it. The other thing is that the sun, you will learn as you get into this, connects to the conscious force, whereas the moon tends to be more of an unconscious habit type of energy. So that, for example, because of the moon having connections to the home, it always does, right? This is the way people behave at home, right? So their sun is their more conscious self when they enter the world. The moon is what they do, and they're more happy-go-lucky. I just do whatever feels comfortable. In fact, comfortable is probably a great word to describe the moon. And you can begin to see that that's a good thing, and it could turn into a bad thing. If you get too comfortable, then some problems will develop, right? But it's good to know that that's the domain you're playing with. Then from there, you go to Mercury, and there you get into the thinking mind, which is, distinctly a human domain thing, even though people will say cats and dogs think and so forth. Yeah, maybe they do, but as I understand it, that would be a completely different Mercury. I don't know how I would examine it in connection, in comparison to the human domain. But if you've done any searching in the spiritual realms and the mental realms, Mercury is clearly a really important planet, although the general sense in astrology is that it takes on the energy of the other planets that connect to it, as opposed to it itself being as dominant. It'll be what if it connects to whatever, Jupiter, Saturn, other planets. But it is really important, and it's important because of all that, the human domain, the human realm, and also in the chart by what it rules and so forth. And I'll be bringing that up as I go along. Then you get to Venus, and Venus is, in the conventional sense, it connects you to value systems, what's important to you, what you like, what you dislike. And then this is why, because it's your sense of aesthetics, it gets into the relationship realm, who you are drawn to. And this is why, books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, that's the polarity of the sexes. Venus is one polarity, the female side. But most importantly, it's your sense of what is beautiful and aesthetic, what draws you that way. And it very much connects to pleasure and enjoyment, which again is good until it isn't, just like any other quality in a chart. Important thing is to know what it rules. If you were going to say, make a comparison, for instance, between the moon and Venus, you would say Venus connects more to desires and wants, where the moon connects more to needs, because it's more primal. There's a sense that you're feeding and you need it to survive. Whereas with Venus, it's more of a sense of desire, right? Then from there, we go to Mars. Mars, in the best possible way to paint it, it's the action principle. You could call it the first minister of the sun in taking action, doing things, getting started. Ironically, I didn't think of this until after I did it, that we're talking now as this is starting with the moon in Aries. And the moon in Aries is like a call to action, a call to doing something. And I'll be asking you to do something, but we'll leave that until later. So that's the best way you can paint Mars. Where it can descend into a problematic expression is that it is an aggressive, warlike planet. And so whenever there's contention, whenever there is discord, you will often find Mars present somewhere, either because the person has it wired in their chart, in important ways, or because it's paying you a visit, to your chart at any given time. And so that's how it works. But, obviously, you probably begin to think that in terms of human development, it's generally better to refine aggression, much less combat, and or worse, into good, solid taking action and staying out of the discord. Right. It also, for example, connects to anger. And, this is a thing, too, with astrology where it gets a little strange when you think, well, Mars is said to be red, and even the planet itself is rusty colored. And I sometimes wonder if, if these planets, they must be actual beings, in some way, because it almost seems too coincidental that the planet is red. It if I ever, feel like my head is going to explode because I've seen a bull or, the redness, the craziness, Mars is around. So, and yet the planet has that color as well. So now with Mars, you're going in the opposite direction to the first that I mentioned, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus. It's toward the sun. The moon is nearby, but Mars, you're going outward. So you're actually stepping into the social realm and taking action. But really, it's any kind of action. You don't have to distinguish and say it's only when you're doing action toward a career or toward something you want to see outside yourself. It can be applied to spiritual work, inner work, just as much, right? Then you get into Jupiter, and really Jupiter, Saturn, that polarity. Those two are really super important. And this is another story that I think I may have brought up on Linda's channel at some point. It's this thing that scientists at the level they're at now, even though I'll say before I say anything else that they're at an amazing level of knowledge, and you hear facts and data that are astonishing, but if you push it enough, you realize they know absolutely nothing. By the time you get them to say, okay, well, how does this really work? They'll say, well, we don't know. We know there was a big bang, but we don't know what banged, why it banged, or we don't know any of that. But we know that it happened at this time, and they have all sorts of other data. And one part of that data is that the best model they have for the creation of the solar system is that Jupiter was drifting into the sun. Apparently, many of these solar systems, the big planet drifts in. And once it does that, you can't have a Goldilocks water zone where humans can exist. It's not going to happen. That's how, one way to look at our life is, in a way, we're water beings, even though we need the fire of the sun to stay alive. So it's like a warm water thing. And Jupiter was moving in, and it turned out that the way things were created, Saturn was there too, and they were spinning together. And somehow the Saturn orbit interlocked with Jupiter and pulled it back out, right? Which is in a way funny, because this is the way Saturn does its thing. Saturn is always saying, whoa, don't do too much of that. Come back. It's like a restraint principle. So then it made it possible for the Earth to be born, because it left a zone where you could get liquid water and then life for it to exist. So these two planets are huge, Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter is the expanding principle. So anything in life that expands is Jupiter, and it therefore becomes the most desirable planet, because People want things to expand. They want things to grow. They want things to be prosperous. And that's great. Like that's just why, the Romans they thought Jupiter was the key member of the pantheon. They put him first. But you can already start to see where with any of these symbols, they have a plus side and a minus side. There is no such thing as a rigid symbol. So it's almost like a range, like you're tuning into a radio frequency. When you tune Jupiter the other way, just think of overexpanding, overdoing it, right? So when you're seeing like a person like Trump, he's got a huge Jupiter and all he does is hyperbole, superlatives, because his overall character is, in my opinion, completely corrupt. He's using it in an expansive way that is incorrect, right? That is disharmonious. And you can also see how if a person is overexpanding in other ways, it could be a problem. So for instance, I'll give you an example. When the moon, which is food, is in a chart in a difficult alignment to Jupiter, that person is likely to eat too much because they're having trouble, getting the Jupiter force to work with them. So then they overexpand, they gain weight, then it causes self-image problems. It starts to cascade. And that's the Jupiter running amok. Another possibility could be take Venus, which is an enjoyment planet, put it in difficult aspect to Jupiter, too much enjoyment. Maybe the person spends too much money, then they create debt, or in other words, it would be the signature of someone who is too much of a hedonist because there's too much pleasure. That's the Jupiter archetype running amok, even though expansion is generally always good. And if you were being really graphic, you would say the in-breath, that's Jupiter because you're expanding, right? To take in air. That's a very direct correlation. Where Saturn, you're contracting, you're doing the opposite. Right? With Saturn would be the out-breath in that sense. Jupiter in, Saturn out. But you have to breathe out in order to breathe in. You start to see the polarities. There's no good or bad. These things all work together. And in fact, Saturn can be the greatest ally of Jupiter because if you have a good ability, strong ability to work the restraining principle, the reducing principle, you generally will do better in your life, right? In fact, for the most part, most people who say, this is the struggle that you see in the teenage years. What tends to happen is you have a Saturn cycle that is 30 years to go around. And so then the way astrology works, I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but it's pretty simple conceptually, so I don't think you'll have trouble with it. It's the idea that you're born and then Saturn moves around half a circle, and at around age 14 and a half, it opposes itself. And that's the moment when a teenager is kind of in full-blown puberty. They're starting to try to figure it out. They have no discipline. They don't know what to do with anything. The parents come in too because the parents say, well, you can't do that. All of this is Saturn. Saturn is saying to them, no, too much, stop. And the parents take on the Saturn role as well, trying to restrain them because they're thinking, I used to be like that and I used to, do things they don't work out. I better tell them. They're not going to hear you. But point is, it's Saturn. Saturn is the symbol. And then going forward from there, your whole life is a quest to get that Saturn restraint to work better and better for you, to refine it, to make it as intelligent and as harmonious as possible. If you think about it, because it's a restraining principle, on the one hand, you'd say, well, that doesn't sound good because it's restraining sounds, but then you think, no, actually, it's a focalizing principle. It's a concentrating principle. It brings things in. And anything you do in life, you're not going to get it done if you don't concentrate. That's why this planet, look at the symbol, right? This is what the Soviet Union used to put on their flag because it's the work principle. And they wanted to create a working society where everybody is working for everyone else. It wasn't like that. It's more of a fascist regime, or was more of a fascist regime. But the idea is that, in the words of an astrologer that once told me way back when, she said to me, with Jupiter, you have the crescent above the cross. So that's first you get the goodies and then you pay. With Saturn, you have the cross above the crescent. So first you pay and then you get the goodies. So Saturn is the idea, I will work now for a future result, right? Work meaning you apply yourself to things. And then this is where you begin to realize that you could say, well, I have a chart, I have a fate. I always say to people, the fated side, the really fated side, maybe 20% at most. I think it's even less. The number of things that are truly, truly fated, certainly 80% or more. If you want to argue, you can say 70%. Who cares? It's very high. It's under your control, meaning what you're doing with all these planets will determine the outcomes in your life. And that's really important because otherwise, this can happen to people that start studying astrology. They start saying, well, when I get Jupiter, things will get better. They'll get better in relationship to what you've been doing, right? And because it's a polarity between these two, Jupiter and Saturn will say, well, what you work for? Here's the result. The Jupiter comes in and gives you something. Even Saturn itself gives you something as the cycles are moving based on what you've been doing. And it makes perfect sense when you realize Saturn is that which creates structures, right? So if in your body, it rules most precisely, it rules your bones and your teeth, anything that crystallizes in the hardest possible way. So when you think of a house, a car, any structure, that's a Saturnian occurrence. But then you can go deeper and say, no, even your body is a Saturnian occurrence because, yes, the skeleton, but all of it really, I mean, the musculature is more martial, but writ large, you'd say Saturn rules the body. The fact that you exist as a body for a period of time is Saturnian. Once you realize all of this, you realize how important it is and how important it is to get to work on some level. Whatever it is that draws you, begin doing the work because that's the result you'll produce, right? And this you see, if you stay with astrology long enough, as you get better at it, you start to notice the cycles get easier, even the ones that are hard, the ones that used to knock you over and have you in anything from, distraught to despairing. It improves because you get better at knowing what to do and how to manage yourself. So now, interestingly as well, notice that Saturn connects to all of what I've said, but it also connects to the idea of limits, right? And the idea it's as far as you'll go, which makes sense because it's the idea of restraint. This is it. This is the limit. And it's the last planet you can see with your eyes. If you look out there, there's a way, I believe, to see Uranus. I saw this thing somewhere where it sounded really complicated. You needed to be in a dark room and you needed special glasses. And there was some way to get this little dot of light. But strictly speaking, you can go out and you can see Saturn if the time permits at night. You could see it in the firmament. It's not quite as bright as Jupiter, but it's bright. By the way, I'll remind you, when you're seeing that light, that is sunlight. And you should be thinking, wow, that's pretty amazing because that light takes, I believe it takes over an hour to reach Jupiter or Saturn. It takes a long time to reach. That's how far it is, right? But yet you're seeing the reflected light from the sun, right? When you're seeing any planet in the sky, including even if you saw the ones through the telescope, it's just that the light takes longer to reach out there. So those are the first 7 that were used for centuries until the outer planets were discovered, for which you need a telescope, you need something more. And so there's the irony that you're bringing in technology in a way, because that's what Uranus ends up ruling, electricity and technology, but yet you needed technology in order to see it, right? So Uranus is next in the scheme, and Uranus is, in a way, all things that Saturn is not, because Uranus doesn't like following rules, and Saturn is almost the planet of rules and regulations. And Uranus says, I'm not going to follow those rules. I'm going to make my own rules, which is good until it isn't, with like anything else. It's always like that. You see this in, once again, my favorite piñata, Trump. He's got a Uranus that is really poorly integrated, and he thinks he's like a teenager. He just runs through things and expresses his id. That would be the idea of Uranus running amok, is the id running amok. However, that's the downside. The upside of Uranus is in a sense full liberation, because if you connect with that energy, you do transcend useless rules. You transcend all the things in your life that limit you. Which is why there's one great irony is that in the Vedic astrology system, they don't use Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Eris. Some of them do now, but for the most part, they use only the inner 7. And yet they labeled Uranus moksha, liberation, which is brilliant as far as I'm concerned. And then they don't use it, which I don't understand. But that is what it is. It's definitely liberation. So you'll see it, though. You'll see it in your life in flavors of that throughout your life, because it's circulating. It's got an 84-year cycle. It takes a long time. Every so often it finds a planet, and it will liberate you from something. However, the liberation can be gentle or it can be hard. For example, if you're in the wrong relationship, it can end it. And there'll be countless stories of people saying, oh my God, that was so rough. I fell apart. But if you ask them a year, 2 years later, they say, yeah, well, I know it was the right thing. I mean, at the time I felt terrible, but I knew that was the right thing. That's because the planet is helping you out. It's just that it's not the greatest medicine at that time, right? And then there are other cases where, without it being necessarily some kind of disaster, something falling apart, it's simply the idea that you go into things that are more you in the individual sense, which is why lots of people that are doing, entrepreneurial business owners, they're likely to have a strong Uranus because they go their own way. And this is something you also see in a lot of politicians, because however many faults they have, and they have many, obviously, even so, Uranus is important because it gives them that drive to express their true nature. And you generally need lots of ambition to get into careers like that. And then you get into Neptune, which is the next one out. And Neptune, again, here, in a sense, is somewhat the opposite of Uranus, in that where Uranus thrives on the pure self, the sense of what am I here really for? What is my true, most unique way of doing this that most pleases me and pleases the world? That would be Uranus. Neptune says, well, yeah, that's cool, but really you're here for everybody else. It's a very democratic planet that says, let's do what is really going to work for everyone, and everyone is equal. And I would actually say it's the most purely democratic planet. You could even say communist in the true sense of communism, because when you say communism, immediately people think of the Soviet Union, but the idea would be like the way Barack Obama, when he was a community organizer, right? Why? Because he was trying to bring in the group. It has that spirit, of everybody being one group and everyone doing, it'd be like saying Neptune would be the perfect expression of the golden rule. Do things that whatever you do, how would someone treat you? And so if a world were like that, it would be utopia. It's in fact one of the ways you could label Neptune as utopia. But of course, there is no utopia, as we all know. So there's a reach toward it, maybe. But here's the thing, right? It's one of the interesting things when you look at the most, and I don't have it here, but I'm just going to tell you, and hopefully you'll remember the U.S. chart. When the U.S. was formed, according to the chart that is, I think, most astrologers use, the Sibley chart, you see that Neptune is elevated. It's at the top of the chart up there in Virgo. And that tells you that whatever else is happening here, whatever else people say about this is going to happen, the other thing's going to happen, we're going to be taken over by fascists, maybe. But Neptune is the democracy planet, and it's up there, radiant and powerful. That's a hard force to overcome, because the nature of the country is to go that way, right? And that's super helpful, because if you put Uranus up there, then it gets dicey. Depending on the cycle, it could turn into a I, my, me thing, and it would be a lot more dangerous. Separate subject, because I know that that's pretty complicated, and I've already said some things about how we're in difficult cycles and so on, but I think it's a good thing that the US has the Neptune there. All right. And then, before I go further, I will say this about Neptune as well. Neptune doesn't just rule that. And this is the thing with astrology, that when you're trying to learn it, what makes it complicated, but also really enriching if you let it enrich you, is that in a sense, you're studying planets that are almost like people. And it's very hard to pin it down, because people have different facets, different ways of doing things. And with planets, you have to think of an extreme person, someone who has, everything good and everything bad all incarnated at the same time, which is pretty rare. So in a way, it's an imaginary person. But the point being, planets and signs too, but especially planets, rule many different things across a spectrum. And many times they'll make sense. You'll say, yeah, that's right. That makes perfect sense that it would do that. Other times you'll say, I don't know how this can be. How can it be that, for example, Neptune can make the most spiritual person and the most corrupt person, because it's the natural planet connection to Pisces, 12th sign, and it has an up in the air, slippery quality. And depending what the person does with it, they'll either do Mother Teresa or Trump. In fact, Trump is the perfect example of a corrupt Neptune. Mercury square Neptune. The man, anything that comes out of his mouth is pretty much, you can count on it being a lie, full stop. He just lies and lies, whatever. He just says whatever he thinks will work for the next 5 minutes. That's Neptune running amok. But on the other side, the greatest, the people that have accomplished most on the spiritual level are also Neptune connected. And then something that I think is relevant to what we're doing here is that Uranus and Neptune, Uranus in the sense that Uranus is the electrical force. So the fact that there's a power grid and we can, do this, you need the electricity, but the actual imagery, the fact that there's a YouTube, the fact that I'm talking with you now, the whole thing is very Neptunian when you're making images so that you're getting some information back. This was not possible in 1700 or, this is something that came out of that period. And a really interesting correlation, which you see in planets by the things that emerge into the culture when a planet is discovered. That tells you what the planet is likely to rule. And with Neptune, it came online, I believe it was 19th century, and it was around almost concurrent with when they started bringing in photography and recorders, things that make copies of reality, right? So the copy, the reproduction. In fact, then this can become like art, because art is not the thing. Art is a copy of reality. But especially the idea that TV, recordings, and then so of course it draws you into the movie industry. Neptune is rampant in the charts of actors, performers, and it has that quality of utopia on that level where people love to make them into celebrities and so forth. So that's an important thing to remember with this planet, because it's really pervasive at the moment. It's been in Pisces in its own sign since 2011, and it's one of the big reasons why we've seen both a tremendous proliferation of great imagery. I mean, you can find amazing stuff on YouTube. I remember studying things like in the 1980s and seeing them on film, masters that I used to study. It's fabulous, because you get this dimension that was not available before, including even great trainings and everything. But concurrent with that, you get the other side, which is disinformation, which is crazy stuff that is not true, which is basically fake. So Neptune is both, in one sense, the greatest truth, but also it's the side that is completely fake. In fact, even to the point of trying to deliberately fool you, because things get complicated if you get too judgmental and say, well, we should eliminate all deception because deception isn't good. Well, that's true. But then you find out that deception, in a sense, is part of nature. I saw this movie, I think it's called My Octopus Teacher, something about an octopus. And this octopus, they have their life cycle, and it was, fighting to survive like any other creature. And the way it survived was it became really good at deception. It figured out, in their way, their strategy was so they wouldn't be eaten by other creatures. So then I thought, well, maybe, this is like the chameleon. They survive by adapting and being like the surrounding foliage or whatever. So it's a life principle, but like anything, it's how much you use of it, how much you don't, and how everything is moving forward in a harmonious way or not. All right, I'll stop there with Neptune. Pluto, with Pluto, you have the last, or used to be the last planet until Eris came in. Pluto, you may have seen the movie I made, the video I posted, where it was discovered in a really synchronistic way, which makes zero sense if you try to make sense of it, because it was a girl that told her father, who told someone else, and then they chose Pluto because they couldn't choose something different. Anyway, long and the short of it is, she never even followed up with any mythology the rest of her life. I think she became an accountant. It was totally fortuitous. And by the way, while Pluto was conjunct her sun too, as she did this, just to add a little bit of flavor on the astrology, the Pluto transit. And Pluto is the lord of the underworld. It totally is. That's what it is in the mythology, and that's what it is in life. That's what it does. So without going too much today into the really difficult dark side of it, of course, if you say death, that's probably darkest already. But see, this is the idea that once you discover that it's death as transformation, and this is really literal. Like, you read it in books and you'll say, oh yeah, transformation. What does that even mean? No, it actually does that. If you let it, sometimes even if you don't, it'll do it regardless. But the point is that it's the planet that can really help you transform, because it can really change you from one thing to another. It's a full mutation. It's a big, big energy, even though it's the size of the moon. It's out there, way out there. It's got this 250-year orbit. It's just the size of the moon. And yet you see it locking into planets, and you see that effect manifesting. I'll be talking about this more, linking it to the, people have asked about this a lot, the Pluto return, because the US was formed in 1776. We're in that range now where Pluto is returning. And yes, it's not easy, particularly, see, this is the thing with astrology, where things get complicated in any chart, including a national chart, is when you get several cycles coming together. In the US, the Neptune cycle is difficult right now. So then when you throw Neptune into it, or Pluto into it, it complicates the situation. But one way I can be optimistic is they're trying at birth each other, and I'm pretty sure the founders were not trying to set up a fascist regime. So in that chart, Neptune is stronger than Pluto. So hopefully Pluto will, in the end, serve Neptune and not the other way around, right? As far as maintaining the democracy. And Eris, I'll just really quickly, because I need to cover a couple more things before we're done today. Eris is the way it was assigned the name, the goddess of discord. That doesn't make it into a great symbol. The better way to focus on it as a potentially good force is that in the myth, the goddess in this case was arguing or being difficult with the other gods or goddesses because she wanted to be included. She was being left behind. And you notice this force that has been rising since 2005, whatever else you can say about our topsy-turbulent situation, whether it's people of color, LGBTQ, any group that has been marginalized is growing in power. And probably the most important thing is you see Eris, in contrast to Pluto, and this is important. Pluto is a bit like a big Mars. So when you think of Mars, you think male. Pluto is like the overly dominant male, which is why Pluto would be associated with fascism, because that would be the ultimate expression of male insanity. Eris is the counterpart where you would say she's the sister of Mars. So you get a big Mars, but with a female force, which is, I think, the final cementing that has been building since the 1980s, I think for sure, is women are gaining power, right? We're gaining power. I actually think it's a really good thing, both because you get better balance. But frankly, I got to tell you, I actually hope that I would be totally on board if someone said for the next 100 years, you can't be a prime minister or you can't be a president unless you're a woman. I'm cool with that. Men have had their run enough. I mean, it doesn't work well. We've seen this. So the thing is with Eris is if you focus on it that way and, realize that even though it is a discordant symbol because you can also see that together with that, in the last 15 years, things have gotten very noisy, very complicated, all kinds of voices swirling around. It's tricky, but overall, it's kind of like Pluto. Pluto comes in the 1930s. You remember, well, none of us remember it, but we can see in history books, that had to be a crazy time. The 1930s and into the 1940s, culminating in a nuclear bomb, horrific, right? But then all kinds of things came online as a result. One of them, ironically, is vaccines. Isn't that interesting, right? That these people that are making all this noise about vaccines, that was when they became something new that could be used. I mean, Roosevelt suffered from polio and, there were no vaccines until the 1930s. They had to test them, whatever. So that's one of the examples. The other would be nuclear power, which I know is more controversial, but it is a source of energy if it can be harnessed. And then, of course, the dark side would be the weaponry associated with it. So those are the planets. And as I expressed them today, the thing about planets is that it's pretty endless, and then you begin to see all kinds of refinements depending on what you're looking at, and whether you're looking at an individual chart, at a situation, at a psychological factor. But here's the thing, and here's where. In keeping with the moon in Aries, which I said earlier is an action, call to action, right? And assuming you want to learn more astrology, want to discover new things with it, etc., getting to the basics is really important. And many of you, some number will already know this and have already done it, maybe even for years. For those who haven't, what I would ask you to do is, first thing that you want to do is find out where your planets are. It's important. I mean, if you don't know where they are, by degree a minute, and I'll explain how that works. So the site I recommend, if you're not buying astrology programs or anything like that, there's a site called astroseek.com. And the person who runs this site is an excellent contributor. It's free. He's doing really amazing astrology calculations, but you can see from the very first page, you can enter your information and you can get your planet positions. And these positions are critical because that is how you then begin to study your chart. And I notice it's the area that people can stumble on, because they don't like numbers. You have to realize that planets get put in a wheel like this, right? Signs go around, then you take planets like, if it's the sun like this, if a person is whatever they are, it's because the sun is in Aries or whatever it is, and so on, like that. And how you know where it is because the sun will have a number between 0 and 30 for that sign. And beginning to get a sense of what that means. Like if it's 15, it's in the middle. If it's 10, it's a third of the way. If it's 20, it's 2/3 of the way. If it's 28, it's really late. Like that. Really basic stuff to get a visual sense of how the chart comes together. And then to avoid confusion too, I'll say about this, when you see 22 and the little, that's degrees. 22 degrees, 34 minutes. I wish that it were done in decimal because it would be probably less complicated, but realize that it goes degree by degree, and then the next number will be up to 60. So 2259 means it's about to turn into 23. And you just get better at realizing, okay, that person, like in the case of this person, 22 and a half. Actually, these are the planets for today. So 22 and a half Scorpio is because 34 is about half of 60, right? And you can label it 34, you can say half, but main idea is to have a sense of what the numbers mean, because was to then progress and look at cycles, you got to be able to relate them back to these degrees. That's in fact, by the way, a great way to describe astrology. What astrology is you've got okay, let's bring the man in. Here's Trump's chart, and what's happening is this is his natal chart. But then I look at where are the planets today and where they are today affecting where they were then. That's the cycles. That's what happens. That's how you do assessments, predictions, and so forth. And the idea is to become so familiar through just practice. It's just practice, repetition, that any chart that you look at, you pretty much right away, you scan it and you know, oh, I see what's happening. Like to give you an example, this recent video that I did on this guy, Bannon, right? So the way an astrologer works is, first of all, you look at what the person is going through, because that's important. And we saw what this guy was doing. You know, he was running scams. And then there was this rumor that he was going to be charged, maybe yes, maybe not. And what I said in my video was, yeah, this looks pretty dangerous because the astrologer looks at where the planets are and gauges, well, based on where they are, what planets are affecting them at this moment, right? So in Bannon's case, you've got that you see immediately, you see Saturn transiting in Aquarius. This year is in the degrees of where Saturn is, a little forward, but it's kind of in the range. And then you see that it's going to move to the next degrees next year, right? So one of the things is when you're doing astrology, it's like what you would say to any potential criminal. You'd say, well, listen, the transits next year are Saturn is around. Is this a good idea to do this? So it's just bad planning, right? Because you move yourself into the the mouth of the beast, so to speak. So you see both what the planet is doing and what it's about to do. But the idea is to be so on top of it that just by scanning, you realize, 4 degrees, 14 minutes, Scorpio, 15:45 Scorpio, and 19 Scorpio 58. Engage. This here shows the ephemeris, but it shows it. What I've done here is do month by month to get a longer view, and you can gauge where the planets will be. And again, if you are not immersed in the language, you'll say, this is Greek. I mean, what are you drawing there? But if you say, oh no, I see that's Aquarius. Yeah, I see those wiggly lines. Oh, that's Taurus. After a while, it's very natural. You just know that's Taurus, that's Capricorn, that's Aries, whatever. And then very quickly you can assess what's going to happen next because you get familiar with the speed of the orbits and how long they're going to be. It is true that at first you do a lot more looking, to check the ephemeris or to check whatever it is you're checking to get your figures. But the idea is to just practice so that these symbols become second nature. That's the key. How are we doing for time here? We're getting close. Okay, so I didn't take any questions at all. And to tell you the truth, I don't even know how, let me see, how would that even work at this stage?
There's a line.
Yeah, I'll take one or two if someone wants to unmute themselves and ask something.
Andre, do you ever use Ceres in your stuff? You talked about using Eris, but I wondered if you use Ceres.
I do. Sometimes I do. The thing about Ceres is that in comparison to Eris, because of the Eris orbit being further out and more longer, and also the synchronicity of when it was discovered, I tend to use those planets more. Ceres is one of the asteroids, and it's considered the most impactful of the four. They're all pretty good, but yeah, Ceres has definite meanings. Ceres connects people to, for one thing, to gardening, agriculture, food. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's where the word cereal emerged, because you see this a lot with planets then, finding themselves in the cultural lore, the cultural parlance of sorts. And so Ceres can be that, but I would encourage you, though, to think of it as more of a condiment. And it's not usually a good idea to say, well, I'm having a hard time because my Ceres is getting a square. That's stretching it. The other planets are bigger, right? So, and then what tends to happen, too, is that if you take care of the other planets, the Ceres will work better as well, because it'll add skill to whatever you're doing with your Ceres. Then it'll depend on where it is in the chart and what aspects it makes. And yeah, so I mean, this is the thing. If you want to dig into symbols, it's pretty endless, because you can add the asteroids, you can start adding all kinds of things. I didn't even touch upon things like midpoints. There's a lot to work with, but it's super important to go one step at a time and learn the symbols, one at a time, and have a good understanding of how they work. One more question? Or
I have a question.
Sure.
If I heard you right, you had compared Saturn to inhaling, Jupiter to inhaling and Saturn to exhaling.
Yes.
Isn't Jupiter sort of expansive? Is it the opposite?
Well,
did I hear you right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. Well, if you think about it, when you inhale, you expand. There's more air, so it's like if you're like a balloon, it gets bigger. Then let it out. But see, this is the thing. This is where it gets very interesting, because if you study astrology, you realize, yeah, these planets rule that 100%. There's no question. But then you realize you can do really, really deep expansion in meditation by doing really long out breath. It's the way that is. It's like the two poles work together. So you actually relax more by deep exhalations, and you vitalize more by deep inhalations. So lots of in-breath is going to wake you up, and the two work together. And when it comes to breath, I always encourage people, get better at this, because breath is your first food, literally, right? The moon, water would be the second food. Breath as Mercury and Gemini, but Mercury as the planet, first food. If you can get good at that, you'll get good at a lot of things, because it's almost like a doorway into self-knowledge and into how to manage yourself, because it keeps drawing into the energy domain. And how that works, and the other end would be, you could say, relaxing too, because at night, it's much better to do exhalations. If you're doing inhalations, you won't sleep, right? So that's the answer to that. All right, one last question.
How many people did you get for your course?
Something like 150, quite a few.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, it's good. Yeah,
Good.
I'm so happy that everyone is interested, and I think it can be a lot of fun, if you really explore this.
Yeah.
So now here's the other thing. I'll finish with this. I'm going to send everyone an email again for this thing where I mentioned getting your time and then assigning a number so that I could mention your chart without anyone knowing whose chart I'm mentioning. It would just be number 45, and you'll know who you are. But I need to get them all sent to the same place, or it's total chaos. And some people have already sent me their birth date, but I need it in one location. So you'll get an email saying, please send me your information to this email. And then when it comes in, I'll be able to put them all in one place and work from there, after which I'll create the chart and send you your number. And then we can go from there, so that in the next sessions, I'll bring up charts and illustrate cycles that are taking place that are affecting that person, whether it's challenging, productive, easy, hard, whatever.
That's good.
Right. And again, I really encourage everyone to as a main task for today's session is get your planet information. Even if you send me your data as well, so I can put it in my database, but get it for yourself so that you can begin to relate to it in that way, because it's super important. All right. That was great, everybody.
Okay.
So what I intend to do is, unless it changes, to do it on a Sunday around this time. The reason I said 4 times a month instead of once a week is just in case I'm traveling or something happens, to prevent it, in which case I'll simply email everyone, send them a message to Patreon that it'll be a different day. And of course, realize that if you can't attend, you can still watch this later and as many times as you want. So it's always there for you. All right, everybody, have a great rest of Sunday.